Virtue theory.
Let's talk about each of the theories more in depth. Let's start with virtue theory. Virtues can be applied to human beings, of course, but they can also be applied to objects. We frequently will list virtues of objects such as a knife has the virtue of being sharp. It's something that's descriptive. And in very much the same way we can think of a whole host of virtues that we like to apply to human beings. Some examples from the history of philosophy include the following. Aristotle talks about 4 cardinal virtues: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. Those were the types of virtues that for the Greeks were most important to have inculcated during one's upbringing. In the Middle Ages, religious philosophers added additional virtues, such as faith, hope, and charity. Virtue theorists tend to have 3 goals in espousing their theories. The first is that they need to develop and defend some kind of conception of what the ideal person is. On the basis of that idea, you need to describe the ideal set of virtues that an agent should have so that they are predisposed to perform actions of a certain type, namely, actions that we would call virtuous. Again, for Aristotle, the ideal person would be courageous and tend to perform actions that were, in fact, courageous, and the same goes for justice, temperance, and wisdom.
Deontology.
Deon is the Greek word for duty, and it's a nice way to remember what the root of deontology is all about. A deontologist regards the fundamental ethical task as trying to do the right thing, or at least avoiding doing the wrong thing. It matters less what kind of virtues you have, or what the consequences of your actions are. What you really need to concentrate on if you're a deontologist is trying to do the right thing, what duty demands, or avoiding doing the wrong thing.
Deontology continued.
If you're a deontologist, the first thing you have to do is you have to formulate and defend what your set of moral rules are. However, frequently our duties can conflict, and we must choose between performing one action or another that are both morally required. To avoid this problem, deontologists need to develop and defend some method of determining what to do when our rules conflict. I like to use a particular example in class to illustrate this problem in deontology. One of my students shows up at my house and knocks on my door. I answer and recognize the student. The student is panting, out of breath, sweaty, and says someone's trying to kill them. Can you please help me? And the first thing I do to determine what I should do is I say, well, certainly I have a duty to help people when they're in trouble. So I tell my student, come on in and I'll hide you in the coat closet. Lo and behold, it's a couple of minutes later and I get another knock on the door. And it's the person who was following the student trying to do them harm. And of course, you would make the argument that you have a duty to protect your student. But according to deontology, don't you also have a duty not to tell a lie? Many deontologists would take that as a fundamental fact, that you should never tell a lie. So this person who is brandishing some kind of weapon, trying to do my student harm, says, all right, Professor Perlman, tell me where your student is. And if I'm a strict deontologist, I have to give the student up and say he's over there in the coat closet. Try not to get too much blood all over the place when you're done. Many people find this example very unsatisfactory. One solution is to talk about priorities in the duties we have. Philosophers have termed these duties prima facie duties, duties that on their, quote, first face, so to speak, we should comply with. These duties can be overridden in certain circumstances. This prioritization of duties allows a deontologist to avoid an inherent contradiction and counterintuitive problem of determining when specific duties conflict.
Deontology and character.
As shorthand for this prioritization of duties and values, deontologists can be said to place value on the state of character known as conscientiousness. Some might argue that by doing so, the deontologist has basically become a virtue theorist. This is not the case. The state of character known as conscientiousness is a disposition to follow rules, despite temptations to make exceptions to those rules. To truly show how this state of character is also not a form of consequentialism, we need only consider that conscientiousness is not an end in and of itself, what the consequentialist would call an intrinsic good. Rather, it's an instrumental good, a good that helps bring about other goods, in this case, instances of rule following. Some very famous examples of deontological theories include the Ten Commandments, which is a type of divine command theory. Many of you who have taken philosophy classes will remember, of course, Kant's categorical imperative, which asks us to act according to those principles that we can will to be universal laws.
Consequentialism.
Let's move on to talk about the last type of ethical theory that we can derive from Solomon's original diagram. Here, what we have is the judgment of the value of the consequences of actions that are most important. So we don't necessarily care that we have a virtuous agent or what action they performed. What matters for us, if we're a consequentialist, is that we bring about some type of consequence or result that we would like to see. So the common example here is utilitarianism, where we want to bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So the famous example is, basically, if we take justice as the thing we'd like to bring about, we may in fact want someone who is very unjust in their own virtues performing some very unjust actions. But if we can prove that having a very unjust person doing very unjust things will bring about the most justice for the rest of the people, then that is valuable and ethical according to the consequentialist. Obviously, according to the two other types of theories, having an unjust agent performing unjust actions is not acceptable, but according to consequentialism, it would be.
Consequentialism continued.
So, if you're a consequentialist, you have three essential goals. The first is you have to specify and defend a list of things, goods, or states of affairs that are good in and of themselves. You need to provide a technique to measure and compare the quantity and quality of these intrinsic goods. And you need to have some kind of policy you can defend in those cases where you can't determine which of a number of alternative actions will in fact maximize that good. And the problem there, with the last goal, is that it is very difficult for us as human beings to in fact predict what the outcomes of our actions are going to be. So we have to make all kinds of probabilistic conjectures as to what those actions are going to do and what amount of good they are going to bring about.
Instrumental and intrinsic goods.
And as we have seen, consequentialists also make a distinction between goods that are instrumental versus those that are intrinsic. For consequentialists, there is a hierarchy of goods. We like to have the intrinsic goods being the highest goods, and the instrumental goods helping us bring about those things that we consider to be intrinsic. So instrumental things are good only so long as they play a role in bringing about those intrinsic goods. The example we started off with, the statement that health is more important than money, is actually a very good way of viewing these types of goods. Health would be the intrinsic good, since everyone wants to have good health. It's good in and of itself. Whereas money can be seen as the instrumental good. Let's say you don't have enough money to buy health insurance. Therefore, your health is going to suffer, and that's not a good state of affairs if you're a consequentialist. And that also illustrates the difference between what's instrumental versus what's intrinsic. Hi, I'm David Perlman, Senior Lecturer, University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and Associate, University of Pennsylvania Center for Bioethics.
Hello, my name is Ryan Smith. I'm an undergraduate student at Transylvania University, and I'm a philosophy and biology double major with a pre-med emphasis. I am currently the summer intern at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Bioethics.
If there are any questions about this particular podcast content, I ask that you please direct those questions to me at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. And my email, for those of you who are listening on audio, is perlmand, P-E-R-L-M-A-N-D, at nursing.upenn.edu.
Funding for these podcasts comes from the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. In addition, we receive support from the University of Pennsylvania Center for Bioethics, the Weigel Information Commons at Van Pelt Library, and the Ormandy Music Center, also located at the Van Pelt Library.